So thanks for coming along. My name is John Clapham, and I am an Agile coach. The thing I really value is the coaching side of that. I believe that that's the thing that really genuinely helps us to change and get things done. In terms of the Agile half of Agile Coach, we can all read a description of something like Scrum or Kanban and understand it at a logical level, but then actually turning that into behavior is something very different, hence valuing the coaching side. I'm here today to talk to you about burnout and sustainable ways of working. And I've got a clicker that has a mind of its own. So behind me is a Gigahara. It's a forest in Japan. It's on the western flanks of Mount Fuji volcano. It's sometimes known as the Sea of Trees. At this time of year especially, it's absolutely beautiful. It's full of acers, rhododendrons, Mongolian oaks. It's strangely quiet as well. Obviously, being on the banks of a volcano, it has a lava substrate. Very little can grow there. The plants and animals eke out a very fragile existence, lacking energy from the soil. And it's really eerily quiet. The forest has got another name as well. It's known as the suicide forest. Every year in Japan, hundreds of people go there to end their life. Some of them go with tents as if to contemplate their next actions. They write letters that are actually never seen by people. They go there in such great numbers, in fact, that the Japanese government stopped counting. In about 2011, it was 200, and it had been rising exponentially over the last 5 years. So they stopped counting to try and draw attention away from the forest, to try and stop popularizing and glamorizing the suicides. Of those suicides, a high percentage are people who had committed Karōshi, or death through overwork, literally ending their lives because they'd had too much of their professional burden and felt that they couldn't continue in the current state. Now, we know that Japan is fairly famous for its work ethic, its lack of work-life balance, perhaps, and this strange phenomenon of career men, when they retire, they suddenly find themselves in homes with wives and families that they haven't talked to for 30 years. And oddly, the strain of suddenly having work-life balance affects them. But we can move closer to home and perhaps to Western cultures. This could drive me berserk. Sorry. This is a quote. This is actually a transcript, if you will. This is a conversation between a father and son. It's too much. I have not slept for 2 days. I have a client meeting tomorrow morning. I have to complete a presentation. My VP is annoyed. And I'm working alone in my office. This guy had done 100-hour weeks straight for almost a year. He was 22 when he committed suicide. He worked for Goldman Sachs in the States. They famously introduced a no working weekends policy to try and combat burnout and to try and work sustainably. The policy didn't include Sundays. Here's another one. As we move away from the States and towards more familiar cultures, this is in Europe. This is a designer. It's not just technical people. It's not just accountants. It's not just high flyers that can suffer from this. This is a designer on the Renault Laguna. My professional activity is the primary cause. It has crushed me and engulfed me to the point where I can no longer see any escape. And despite having a family and a huge number of friends, he still chose to finish it there. On the M1, now right in England, the police pulled up behind a car on the hard shoulder. In the front of the quite expensive sports car was a fellow who was just rocking backwards and forwards. He was mumbling incoherently. They asked him where he was going, couldn't remember. They asked him where he'd been, couldn't remember his name. He said, I must get the figures ready. The manager is on my back. I need to perform better to get promoted. He'd just done 1.5 years of 6-day weeks. And his body had just said, right, that's enough. I'm going to blow the fuse to protect your brain. If we move even closer to home, and obviously I've been illustrating by extremes, and don't worry, we move away from the darker stuff slowly throughout this, if this is too heavy. Oliver Wood, a friend of mine from the DevOps scene, his team in sunny Surrey, they adopted this slogan because it's great for continuous delivery. Go live or die trying. That sounds all right, doesn't it? He then said, we did, and we were idiots. What happened to him was he got a collapsed lumbar, one of his vertebrae. This is a condition often associated with heavy lifting, with serious muscle work, and he got it from sitting at his desk for so long, so regularly. It caused him to create this site, Good Coder, Bad Posture. I'm not sure if it's particularly PC, it's basically posture shaming people. If I look around this room now, I wonder if I should be creating Good Coach, Bad Posture. Oh look, everyone's shuffling. Interesting. But you know, he had to have years off work. It cost him considerably, it cost the company considerably. He could no longer stay in London, he had to move to somewhere where he could be more comfortable, have his house adapted. And this is all because of working a lot. So what I want to do today then is to introduce you to burnout and kind of raise awareness of it. We're not going to go too much into the brain science. I want to raise awareness. I want to talk about why I think that Agile is particularly susceptible and the part that you might play, really regardless of your role in a team, that might further it, and indeed how you might protect yourselves from it. And then I want to talk about some things that we can do about it. So, what is it? Well, burnout is one of those things that's hard to define. If you think about engagement, if you think about when you've really enjoyed a task, when you've been in that mythical state of flow, so coding, playing Lego, building something, playing Agile games, being in one of the wonderful workshops here, you may recognize your performance and your feelings increasing with happiness. This is the classic employee engagement graph. And what we can notice is a couple of things, right? Your discretionary effort. This is the amount of effort you choose to give. Down at the bottom here is almost the minimum viable job. What do I have to do to not get the sack? I'm sure none of us are familiar with that here. Between there and the want to do is the effort we give out of choice. Classic example, if you want to blog about something, you know, do you do it for the company or do you put it on your own blog? You're making these choices. You know, do you be bold and shout out that great idea you've just had, or do you keep it quiet because you're not engaged enough to care? Burnout is the opposite of this, essentially. Burnout is sometimes defined with an antithesis as the opposite of engagement. So while engagement we see energy, involvement and efficacy, with burnout we tend to feel exhaustion, cynicism and inefficacy. This is the burnout antithesis from Christina Maslach. She is quite famous for being the person who stopped the Stanford prisoner experiment. I don't know if you've heard of that one. So she's got a bit of a reputation for, as a psychologist, you know, empathizing and perhaps, you know, taking a more human approach. You know, that particular experiment was ready to carry on in quite a brutal way in the name of science. And she just said, look, this is not an appropriate way to experiment. Freudenberger then, so he was one of the first people to really investigate burnout, to coin a term for it and to study it. He describes it like this: burnout is really a response to stress. It's a response to frustration and it's a response to demand. But the crucial thing to take away is this: it's actually from yourself. It's about how you interpret things that come in and whether you turn that into an expectation that you can meet or not. Freudenberger learnt about this because he grew up in a pretty harsh environment. He had a difficult family upbringing, but he wanted to do good and he wanted to help people. And so he would work in his clinic, doing therapy, you know, for pretty long hours a day. And then he would go to a volunteer clinic that he'd set up in a deprived area of New York and work more. And he noticed that he was running out of energy. He noticed that he wasn't as effective. And the way he noticed it was this. He started to diagnose himself. He would go home, sit down, and record a conversation with himself, much as he would with his clients. And then he would take a break, make a cup of tea, have a bagel, whatever American folks do in their breaks, and then he would play back the recording and analyze it as if it was someone else. And one of the things that was really startling him was this: I don't know how to have fun. I don't know how to be readily joyful. In other words, it became effortful for him to enjoy his life. And this was the trigger for him to look into burnout as a concept. And so what he did was to identify a number of stages that lead to burnout. Now let me just clarify that what I'm talking about here is, or what I'm about to show you is progress towards clinical burnout, which is obviously a very serious condition. Thankfully quite rare. I've given this talk twice now to audiences about this size. And what is scary is that after each one, someone has come up to me and said, I had clinical burnout. And if you think about that, that's like 1 in 50, just from the population of a typical conference. So clinical burnout is out there, but also the steps towards it are quiet and insidious. And it can take up to 2 years to really kind of show the symptoms and really know it's time to get help. So here's the steps then. I present to you, obviously Agile wasn't around when Freudenberger was thinking about this, but this is the burn down to burnout. So this is how all burn downs go, right? Trend line, and then there's just that insidious little bit that's wrong. So what do? We think we can do it. We think we can carry on. We still keep our ambition. We still keep our scope. And it's coming from us. So we work harder. We work harder to achieve that goal. We work harder to get on with the self-imposed demand. In order to do that, maybe we start to neglect our personal needs. Just little things start trimming off. Maybe we do less jogging or going to the gym or all those strange things I've heard people do. Then we start more psychological things. So we sort of tried to deal with the demand by being efficient. But now we're trying to trim things away. And because our brains are tired constantly, because thinking is effortful, we suffer from ego depletion. Essentially, we don't have energy to think about stuff. We start avoiding the hard stuff that needs a lot of thought, like conflict. And so you start to see withdrawal, you start to see avoidance, the classic thing, I'll think about it later. Can we talk about that later? And it could easily be that these are starting to surface at home rather than at work, because your energy is your energy, and you have it while you're awake. And the brain doesn't really care if it's going into work or home life. Whoa, so that's way too quick. So you start to revise your values now in order to try and meet the demand, to meet with the self-imposed pressure, or the pressure that comes from outside, as we saw earlier. You're revising your values and principles now. So maybe I'm not so nice to that customer. Maybe I'm not listening so carefully to the person that I'm coaching or working with. People might be noticing now, but you're still denying there's an issue. You're still thinking, I can just work hard to get over this one hump, and then I'll be able to set myself right. Goldman Sachs again, who were responsible for the no working at weekends, they recommended that all their employees took at least a week off every year to get their work-life balance back. Because that works, doesn't it? You can do all of life in a single week. But you don't notice it because you're in the soup. Social withdrawal. All right, so now this is all that matters. The thing that I'm striving for is all that matters. And so I'm withdrawing from the social networks. I'm withdrawing from the very things that could be supporting me and helping me to get out of the situation. Behavior changes. So people are really starting to notice now. Being slightly erratic, maybe coming to work later. There's physical fatigue at this point. So you maybe be late, going home early, perhaps less productive, less performant. But again, denial is going on throughout because you're almost too tired to stop and analyze. Depersonalization. So this is where it gets really deep, and everyone around you is just a source of interrupt, a source of nagging. And this is particularly hard because, and I guess this will resonate with coaches in the room, we're in a sort of helping profession, a caring profession where we need to give a lot to the people that we're working with. If you depersonalize them and just view them as irritations or an hour to get through or as a price tag, you can no longer be effective in that role. And now because of all this, as we head further in, we start to feel emptiness. And then, Sorry, folks. And then depression generally follows. And finally, we don't get to the end because there's just collapse. And this is the point I mentioned earlier, where essentially the body kicks in to protect the brain, the fuse blows, and it says, you are going to rest, and I'm going to do something to you to make sure that you do. The unfortunate thing, of course, is that at that point, you're already extremely depleted. So it takes a lot more than rest to bring you back to where you were. So let's look at the primary causes then. So the mismatch of job and person then. So essentially this is about a person's ability and readiness to do the thing that they're asked to do. We're all different, right? So we can all take on different things. We can all cope with different situations. Some people crave high pressure and lots of interactions, others less so. An absence of fairness, this really gets to us all, of course. You know, we need to know that we're being treated well, especially in artificial constructs like organizations. Value conflicts, so let's say I'm being asked to work in a way or behave towards people in a way that is not congruent with my beliefs. So, you know, I'm suddenly asked to work on defense projects or those kind of things that maybe don't chime with me. All right. We're going to dig more into those causes shortly. So the next question then, is Agile actually susceptible? Is it more susceptible? I wonder. So I did a little Google around, and the first thing I noticed was this stuff. I don't know if any of you have seen this. T-shirts that say Scrum Master, because Miracle Worker isn't an official jobs title. This one here, Scrum Master Save the Team. This was someone's blog post. He was super excited because he's about to start a new job as a Scrum Master. So he made that, put it on his blog, and then he went really quiet. This huge elevated expectation that comes from both ourselves and from the methods and from the buzz around Agile and all the hype, that suddenly it's going to solve everything. It's the silver bullet, and all we need to do is rock in with some principles and some post-it notes. The organization will transform, everyone will be happy, and all of the customers will be happy. Well, does anyone find that? No. So there's a huge expectation. Now, one of the other significant points is around roles. This is Roman Pichler's product ownership wheel, and you can see just a tiny microcosm of what a product owner is asked to do. A lot of the literature makes it very clear what is expected. And they'll say things like, the product owner looks after the what. Is that enough to go about your daily business? Is that enough to know how to deal with this enraged stakeholder or prioritize this project owner's stuff over this project manager? Probably not. There's an awful lot to it. And so it turns out that roles are one of the most significant causes of burnout symptoms and stress in the workplace. This is Two-Face from the Batman cartoons. I don't know if anyone recognizes him. He was able to make decisions just by flipping a coin, but it's not like that for the rest of us. You know, the role stress as a cause of burnout and general stress is something I cannot explain to you enough the importance of it, really. There's an inter-role conflict. So this is where we have two different definitions. Now, wait, I always get these two wrong. Perils of dyslexia. So inter-role conflict is where a person has multiple roles in their lives. So the classic one would be being a parent and being a career person. So let's say that there's a really important meeting at 3 o'clock and then you get a phone call to say you have to pick up the children. Immediately you have a conflict. Your two roles are in tension. And if that's constant and if that's high or hard to deal with, we trend towards burnout is highly uncomfortable. Inter-role conflict, this is where people have different definitions of our role and try to superimpose them on us. So we are product owners, classic one, Scrum Master. Everyone's got a different idea in their head of how they think other folk should behave. And if it's not surfaced and discussed, then it can be pretty damn unpleasant, frankly, from the conversations I've had with people. You don't know where to turn, you're trying to meet multiple sources of demand, there's a lack of clarity in what you're doing, which leads to a lack of purpose. Person-role conflict, so we touched on this earlier. This is where the role is not suited to you as an individual at this time. You're not well trained, you don't have a propensity to do it, so let's say that things like marketing, which often the personalities there are famously gregarious and famously brilliant in terms of their stamina to talk all night to people and go out drinking and all that kind of stuff. We're not all like that. And in fact, a lot of people in IT are somewhat towards the other end of the scale in that regard. And so the role has to suit the person. And then we get role strain, essentially, where the role is too much. And then we come to pace. Here's some people after a sprint. I'm sure you all know what that feels like. These are the graphs that are often used to sell Agile. Has anyone seen these before? I really want attribution for this. So if anyone knows who I need to give a hat tip to, please come and see me afterwards. Essentially, and this is a bit evil because what it's doing is comparing the best of Agile to the worst of waterfall. So it's a bit of a non-argument. But red is the thicker lines are Agile and the dotted lines are conventional or waterfall development. And so we can see the advantages in terms of, or it suggests the advantages in terms of visibility, adaptability, value, and risk. Brilliant. But what about pressure? Because we're always iterating. Potentially we take a break after a sprint, or maybe we haven't quite delivered, so we go into another and another and another. If you think about a waterfall development, you have long phases, and there's a lot of time to recharge in between those phases. The pressure comes on at the end, fair enough, and then often it's sustained, but ahead of that, there's a lot of thought space. I've sometimes seen this with teams doing quite aggressive Kanban, where there aren't even the fire breaks at the end of an iteration, because they're just more and more and more, and they visualize demand and then somehow try to meet it all. So I think there's a real danger with Agile from that. Hello, I think I'm glitching. This is, so this slide I've just borrowed from Alan Kelly's talk. I don't know if anyone was in there. He was kind enough to lend it to me, so I'm not familiar with the transitions. The point it's making is, this is transistors per CPU added over time. So you might not quite be able to see it, but 1940 is the far end of the graph, and 2010 is here, where it goes up to billions. And this is intended to indicate how compute power is coming on. Exponential rises, ridiculous rises in the complexity of what we can do in the tech that we're surrounded by. Do you know what's happening to the brain at the moment? This is what's happening to the brain. It's taken us several million years to get to here, where it's plateaued. So if you compare those two graphs, we are not evolving as quickly as the tech that surrounds us. We're automatically stressing ourselves trying to keep up. And it gets worse. Multiple interactions. Everyone wants us all the time now, and we have these urges to go and interact and go and meet that demand from other places. We want to socialize with people outside of the room rather than staying present. Again, more strain, more conflict. Who am I? Am I the person on social media who's out there tweeting all the time, or am I here in the room with you lot? If you ever get a chance, check out Sherry Tuckle's Connected But Alone TED Talk. She was editor for Wired. She kind of saw this stuff coming. She talks about it very eloquently and kind of the battle to bring back our social networks and community, but not the electronic social network, if you see what I mean. And then the other one is a thing called Boreout or rust out, whereby it turns out that being bored is almost as dangerous as being overstressed and having this high demand. This is Amy Edmondson's psychological safety graph. And you can see, or quadrant I should say, you should be able to see down here the apathy zone, where you've got low safety and low accountability. And so essentially nothing's getting on. This is where we get very, very bored. And similarly, the comfort zone. If we as Agile folk create the safe space but don't provide purpose and some sense of drive or something that we can use to measure self-achievement of purpose, we're suddenly in this comfort zone. But oddly, we find that a little bit boring, and that can cause us to bore out. Okay, so let's have a little look at what kind of things we could do. So that's just a note to self. That is, in fact, usefully relevant at this time. So the first thing we could do is fix the organisation and not the person. You know, we often look at burnout as being, we associate it with being an individual condition. That person burnt out, therefore they're weak, or there's something wrong with them, and it is just that individual. But you remember the car on the motorway? This is what the boss of that person said when they were interviewed. Corporates send them to me, and I either make them or break them. Well, obviously, he wasn't made of the right stuff, so I broke him. That's not about the individual, is it? Chances are that boss will go on, get promoted, and do that again and again and again. And I expect you've all worked with similar people. So in order to do this, and really these are just little things to try and lodge in your brains to look up later. I'm not going to explore these in any depth for time reasons. So sustainable workload seems really obvious, but also sustainable pace and sustainable pressure. Deadlines aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves, as long as there's suitable recharge time afterwards. Choice and control. So again, you'll recognize some of Dan Pink's autonomy, mastery, and purpose here. And I guess to a first approximation, head for that. It's easier to remember, and it will help here. But certainly some level of say in what you're doing and how you're doing it. Recognition and reward. You know, we're told this time and time again, but I wonder how much we really listen to it. The little things count. And, you know, once you're up to a certain point, the more cash, more toys, more trimmings does not make a difference. It's the little things, having a friend at work, someone saying thanks, someone saying well done, and actually giving valuable feedback as well. So thanks is good, but thanks and I really liked, or thanks and this was really valuable, that's a great thing to give to a person, and generally we're very responsive and thankful. Supportive community. So communities just seem to be like a kind of antibody fallback in organizations where they're vibrant and energetic, because if the organization is getting things wrong, but they're allowing communities to thrive, they'll often cater for and compensate for a lot of the things that we would find stressful and pressuring. And then, of course, if things work really well, those communities start to put pressure on the organization to make changes, and you get this kind of virtuous circle. Fairness, respect, and social justice, we touched on it earlier. You know, if you're in a frontline team, it's in a large organization, it's obviously quite hard to influence these things, but what you can do is feedback and call out when these things aren't happening, and provide support for people if you believe they're in this situation. Clear values and meaningful work, exactly as we said before. We want to know where we're going. That focus helps. So if you're interested, you can try the burnout test. There's a number of different ones depending on your profession. There's a general burnout test. You can look it up. If you look it up, the Maslach's burnout inventory, you will find one that you can pay $20 for, which is the original and nicely worded one. And you can find an awful lot of rip-offs of it as well, which you can do for free. It's probably better to pay for it so that you give money to that body of work and help contribute. It asks you questions like this. I feel I have no one to talk to. Not at all, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. I feel that organisational politics or bureaucracy frustrate my ability to do a good job. I did this as part of the research for this talk. I did it late at night, and I was pretty surprised by the results, and I'm not going to share them with you because I don't think the irony would be, I don't think you'd be able to cope with the irony. So it's quite revealing to do this. Of course, the challenge is that if you know you're doing a burnout test, that's on your mind. It's medical school syndrome. You're going to be thinking, yes, I have that, and it will sway your answers. And equally, if you want to do it with your teams, which is quite an interesting approach to use as a kind of framework for a conversation, you're in a tricky balance, because the more you tell them about the purpose of the survey, the more likely their answers are to be slewed, but then you want to be transparent and tell them why they're doing the thing in the first place. You could walk through it with the group or offer it to people and then discuss afterwards and recognize that it is just like all these other surveys. It's a representation or reflection in the moment rather than a diagnosis and a verdict on the rest of your working career. It's a really interesting thing to do, and it makes you think about, it makes you more aware of your feelings and the pressures on you. So you rate yourself on the scale of 3 things: exhaustion, cynicism, and professional efficacy. I've got a game to play, which I can quickly whiz through now. This is a direct response to finding myself talking a lot about roles. I seem to have developed this niche almost, where various people go away for 2 popular 2-day Agile certification courses. A large number of people will take that course in an organization, and then about 2 weeks later, those teams are suddenly thinking, how do I deal with this? Here's a specific problem. I've looked at my course notes. It doesn't tell me how to deal with this situation. You know, I've got 20 stakeholders, and I've only got 1 developer. How on earth do I meet that demand? You know, my Post-its and Sharpies really aren't solving this. And the role game then, in particular, helps people who've just been introduced understand how to work together. So we might have notional separation of role, like product owner and scrum master, user researcher, content designer, those sort of close overlapping type of roles where it's important to form a productive partnership. We ask some very specific questions. What are you doing now, and what should you be doing? But we look for actual things, not things that we can take from the manifesto, not things that we can take out from the coursework. And then we rate on a whiteboard. You just draw this up. Definitely, sometimes, maybe, and not ever. And then we plot. And it's a framework for a conversation. 2 people in the room, role A and role B. Draw a crude line down the middle. And then we can start to work out a productive way to move forward. It's a bit like agile chartering, but with just a couple of people. Role chartering, if you will. The patterns I often see, avoiding, big gap in the middle. There's something there that either neither of those folk can do, or neither wants to do, or maybe they think it is the other's territory, and therefore it's not getting done. And sometimes you see this light bulb moment. Oh, I thought you were doing that. No, you're doing that. Nope. I see complementing. This is like the perfect productive partnership. Overlapping of roles that is productive. You can see this if you go to a good, busy coffee shop. You'll notice no one really has a particular role. They just flow around and do what needs to be done, almost without talking or thought. That's this going on. That's complementing. Intruding, so now I'm inflicting help. I'm going way over into someone else's role without asking. Ooh, hello. And invading. So this is even further. This is the extreme of that. There's not even conversation now. I'm just doing that person's role without talking. These are the kind of things that are surfaced. Now, in looking for this, I also learned about a thing called Herculean Donut, which is an agile game that you can look up. Similar in concept. Draw a giant donut, all the roles in your team, and say who's doing what. I also learned about these cards, which are available from the Indigo Blue stand here today. They have essentially a large number of roles written on them and a number of different tasks, and you can use them to play something like this game. Lawrence Wood is going to talk a bit more about it tomorrow, so you might want to have a look at his talk. He'll show you how to use those. That's an exciting discovery. The other thing to note, if you're in charge of a team and you suspect that they are running low on energy, they're getting fatigued, and there is a danger of burnout, often the temptation is to do more ourselves. Often the temptation is to put more in. And you think about the burn down chart that we had earlier, that's where it all starts. We sometimes talk about the oxygen mask principle, which is help yourself before you help other people. Anna Obrukova, who's talking here today, she's got a great talk on this called Coaching a Tired Team, so it'd be well worth looking that up. There's a lot more proper science in that, so I feel like I'm the kind of pop music and she's the classical music to this subject. She just puts it brilliantly. She says, you can't help anyone if you're dead. So, but do bear that in mind. You know, if you're at the helm of the team, or you think you're the person who is helping the team innovate, or you're challenging the team, you have to look after your energy if you're going to do that effectively. Have we gone backwards? So, I said that we should really try and fix the org, but we could also try and develop the person. John Milton said this: the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. Now he knows, he's got a rough. The point here is that how we interpret thoughts is significant. Does anyone practice mindfulness as a thing? Okay. So you might be familiar with this as a concept then. Thoughts arise. It's almost entirely up to us how we interpret them. And if we work on that interpretation, we can often train ourselves to be more resilient and have a different outlook when events occur. Has anyone seen Kung Fu Panda, the film? So in that, there's a moment where Sensei, I want to say Sensei Wu, but I think that's Lego. Anyway, the main sensei is sitting under his tree having a sleep, and someone rushes in and says, bad news, bad news, bad news. And he just looks at them and says, there is no bad news. There is no good news, only news. It's about how you interpret thoughts. And there's a brilliant book about this. This is Albert Ellis. It's the basis of rational emotive therapy. The way he explains it is really eloquent. It's really readable and digestible. You don't need a background in really anything to read this book. And he talks about this as a concept. He talks about some exercises and some things in therapy that he does to, as he says, to make yourself less disturbable. So I really like that as a self-help book. This one, The Happiness Advantage, anyone read this? So this is a roaring read. It's great on the plane or something. It's very enjoyable. It's one of those books that sort of goes, I want to introduce you to the notion of happiness. Here's a narrative, and that's the power of happiness. Wait, hang on. Where's the correlation and where's the proof? He's got some good grounding in it. There's some great techniques like reciting 3 good things that happened to you during the day at the end of the day, and that encourages you to see positive things as you go about life generally. And if you think about when we're in a state of burnout or when we're fatigued, we're often not seeing those positive things. Darren Brown's got a slightly differing opinion on this one. What he says is that it's all very well trying to make ourselves happy such that, and say that we can achieve our goals and say that belief is all that drives it. But if we haven't really considered properly if our goals are attainable, we're just going to take ourselves happily and confidently to a miserable place. So a dose of realism is important as well. This, I think, is one of the most crucial things. We talk so much about time management, but actually managing our energy, not our time, is the thing that seems to get results. Arianna Huffington of the HuffPost, serial entrepreneur. She has a family. She is remarkably balanced despite all the things that are going on around her and all these huge achievements. And that's because her focus is managing energy, not time. She's got some great stuff out there, specifically about trying to manage our workloads. There's an app that they do which can, essentially you can select key contacts and then you have a quiet time, but only the key contacts can get through if they need you. So you can isolate yourself and recharge for a while, knowing important people can still get to you. We all need to know when we're thinking about managing energy when we're at our best for certain tasks. So it's interesting to try planning your day around that. If you know that you're bright and ready for thought in the morning, then schedule your thought work then. If you know that's when you like to warm up by chatting to people, try and turn your schedule towards that. Make sure you have recharging time in your schedule. All of these things, a bit of journaling at the end of the day, if that really helps. So just try that. When you get back to work, try thinking about energy, not time. I really believe we are managing for the wrong thing. This book is brilliant. The Power of Full Engagement. It talks in detail about this concept. They outline 4 types of energy. Physical, it's pretty obvious. You need to keep up your fitness. Emotional, so that's where you are, with regard to your mood. Mental, so that's subtly different because that's about how much kind of thinking power you have left. So you can still be in a great mood but unable to think. I'm sure you've all fallen over in front of a box set at the end of a hard day. That's that time, right? You just have no mental energy left, but you're still fine emotionally. Spiritual, so this is another source of recharging other than work. It's like your North Star, so again, religion, family, art, hiking, outdoors, all of those things. I find something that's great for recharging is to do coaching sessions walking around. I admit these people aren't actually walking around, but it does show Bristol, which is nice, and this is where I do a lot of my coaching sessions, walking around the harbour. Some fascinating things happen. When you're walking along beside someone, you're suddenly not thinking so much about body language. You're concentrating more on tone of voice and what they're saying, and you can be somehow more reflective. It feels okay to look down and look away and think for a minute before you look up and engage and talk to someone about something. As we walk, we get 20% more blood to our brains, so we're thinking better. All right, so let's try and wrap this up then. Or not. Thank you for your patience with the clicker, which I'd imagine all the other presenters have found worked perfectly. So what we've got then is burnout, I hope you realise, is the opposite of engagement. It's a long process, it's a serious condition, but the steps to it are very small and incremental, so it is very easy to find yourself on the way and very hard to recognise that you are on the way. I think this is a brilliant thing for thinking about meaning and what we do and balance. There's a lot going on this graph, but on this diagram, but the main thing is to find a balance between what you love doing, what the world actually needs, and what you're good at. Somewhere in the middle, Japanese concept of ikigai. You can just Google this one. I appreciate it's hard to see from there. So Christina Maslach, again, she describes burnout as being a syndrome of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced accomplishment when you're no longer able to give yourself at a psychological level. We're not going to do that. Oh, I've gone somewhere crazy now. So, we went literally 10 slides ahead. So I hope I've shown you how serious this can be. I hope I've shown you that the influences come from the organisation, interactions with people you love, interactions with random people. I'm sure lots of people are burnt out because of PPI calls, in fact. It comes from a lot of circumstances. It comes from overwork, is the classic one we always reach for, but it can also come from underwork, not enough to do. It can come from how we match up to the jobs we're doing and the things we try to take on. Some of it is about us, and a lot of it is about the environment that we choose to live in and the things that we crave. So I want to just leave you with this question. Who is actually going to design your life? Thank you very much.